So we're going to, I've just started recording. So 82, and we're going to look at the apartment building at lot 6737 Villaflor Crescent, Woolner NT. And we're going to firstly identify both the planning zone and the use of this building. So using NR maps, we've identified the zone as MR. Has everybody seen where that information has come from? Can everybody see that on NR maps? Have you got it, Andy? Got NR maps? Not yet? Give everyone a chance just to have a look at where that information comes from, because it's really important. I'll get you, Andy, to tell me what town we're in. What planning town of are we in when we're... You can get that information off NR maps as well. So MR, what does MR stand for? Multi-residential. Okay. Do we have a town there, Andy? What other information are we getting from our NR maps? Everybody on NR maps, looking up their lot number. You all right with that, Sahar? You're already in there? So the suburb, what did you guys put in for the suburb? Is it Woolner? Here we go. And using our little information button. Or along here, we'll see a lot of information. Street number 7, Villaflor Crescent. Location name, Town of Darwin. All right, more information up in our maps. Just write up all our information here. Make sure you're writing down this information, because I'll have to rub this off in a while. You know, on the application form, it asks you for this information. We also know it's now number 7, Villaflor Crescent. So when we're in our maps here, the other thing we might want to do at this point while we're in here, we can confirm our parcel area there. Parcel area is 2280, is that right? Meters squared, yep. Privately owned. Yeah, everybody's looking at this information, making sure they're noting as much as off from here as you can. That's about all we'll get from there. But the other thing we want to do while we're in here is look at the planning zones. So remember we said we go into the filters here, into the layers, and we're going to come down to the land administration using our little plus sign on the right here. We're going to go into planning, and we want to see the town planning zones. Okay, so now we can see on our map that and I can't see the legend, which always drives me a bit insane in here, but we can see that we've got a change in zone right around our site here, that this lighter colour, which I'm assuming is SD over on this side, so I can easily find that out by just clicking on the information and clicking on that lot. And then along here, it's going to tell me for the lot across the road what the planning zone is. Have I gone past it? Planning zone, SD. Okay? So why do I want to know that? Why do I want to know what the planning zone is across the road from my development? Any ideas? Sometimes in the planning scheme it talks about this clause applies if your zone abuts or adjoins another zone, okay? So it's always very important to have a look around at the beginning of your application, not only what the zone is of your actual site, but what the zones are around you, what adjoins or abuts your site. So I know that these are all SDs over here. I'm quite interested, to be honest, in what this is here, right beside me, because this is truly adjoining my site. I'm actually sharing a boundary. I'm also noting in here that there seems to be something happening along here and here. Most likely an easement, the way it's laid out there, but it could be a road, it could be a laneway, it could be lots of different things. So I need to identify what it is, because do you see the way that we've got this boundary? Oops, sorry. We've got this boundary going on around this particular lot, and then this is our lot, but there does seem to be something along the middle there. So I definitely want to click my little I button and click in there and see what zone that is in there on. It's street number 11.
Sorry, how did we get the zoning on your map?
Okay, we'll go back and have a look at that again. So over here, so, let me go right back. So you are probably in here in the search one. So you go into layers above and you scroll down until you see land administration. It generally will come up like, oh, where have I lost it now? There we go, land administration. And just using the little plus buttons on the side, click down and you want to click into planning, this one here, and town planning zones. Once you've got that ticked, it should generate on your map some colour indication of the different zones. Have you got, everybody got that working? Got that working, Despina? And you can see them. And then look at, as we know, on a big zoning map like this, there's a lovely legend on the bottom telling us what all the different shaded colours are in, but this one always frustrates me a little bit because I can't actually see the legend. I have to zoom way out to see the legend, and I know it takes so much time zooming in and out of this huge database that I tend to just use my little information button here to click on the lots around it and click the information, and then that way I can clearly see what that zone is. Yes? Won't come on? That's all right. Make sure everybody's in there with their zones. So you need to go up here to layers. Yeah. You don't need to put anything in there now. I would just take that out. Yeah, just in the layers and then click the plus there beside land administration and beside planning. And then just click the tick box there. And then, yeah, it should just bring it up for you. Okay? Anyone else having difficulties there in NR Maps? Everybody seeing that? Okay, have you got your zones on? How come they're not showing up? Just press enter maybe. It's strange, you've got it turned on and it's not generating it. Just don't click on any, see where these are all selected. Why are they all selected? You've got, seem to have a lot of things opened here. Can you go back to the search? Let me just have a look here for a second. Nothing in there at the moment. I don't know why these are highlighted. All of them. It doesn't seem to be a way to turn them off, does there? Hold on, let me just. Now, don't know why. Just didn't seem to come on the first time, but you've got it there now. Okay. So I want to find the planning zone of this adjoining site. Has anyone else found it for me already? We got town planning zone SD13. So we want to make a note of that. The other zones. SD13 looks like one of those special purpose zones or a single dwelling maybe for the SD. We'd have to look that up in the planning scheme. SD13, and then we also have SD. Across the road. So again, just at the start of the application, just information gathering, trying to find out as much as we can around the area. Now, so the next thing we need to do is go to our definitions in the planning scheme, and we want to define a use. So the two main things that we want to do at the beginning of our application. Number one is identify your zone, always. And then number two is our use. What is it? And we can only do that by going through the definitions in the planning scheme and looking for the definition that's as close to the use of this building as we can possibly find. So in our planning scheme, definitions are number 3, definitions. And this will click to it for me. So lots of definitions there. I hope you've all had a chance at this stage to look through all of the definitions. We won't read through all of them, but we need to have a look through and find the closest one to our use. So I'm just not going to read through all these, but we're certainly not abattoir or agriculture. They're alphabetical in the definitions, so we just want to keep going. We're not a building setback. In fact, actually, because this is the definition of every sort of reference in the planning scheme, maybe the best place to go for, straight away is to the zoning table. So if we go to the zoning table, see down here, number 5, zoning tables. If we go to the zoning table for MR, yep. And so the next page is the actual zoning table. This will tell us the list of uses along here, and maybe this is a quicker and easier way to go first and identify your use, and then we'll go back to the definitions to make sure that our use is more in line with what we're doing. So just going to zoom in here a little bit. So again, we're not an abattoir. None of these uses are coming out at me at the moment. None of them are residential. We've got one residential here that's a group home. Is this apartment building a group home? What does a group home mean? Sorry? Townhouse? No, not a townhouse. No. A group home is more to do with the people who live in it. So they're usually a group of people, maybe senior citizens. St. Vincent de Paul do lots of group homes for, for homeless people where they want to take them off the street. So they're generally, a group home is a little bit different to a hotel. So a hotel is is not classified as a residential building, but people do stay in a hotel, but very temporarily. So they're usually not used to their surroundings, okay? So if you go to stay in a hotel for 2 nights, you don't necessarily know exactly where all the fire escapes are or what's the easiest way to get in and out of the hotel and what's your nearest exits and things like that. Whereas with a group home, it's more that people are going to live there in a semi-permanent sort of manner, you know. Sometimes, for instance, group homes for homeless people are temporary, but temporary as in weeks or months, not temporary as in 2 days. So we tend to differentiate between these types of buildings because we want to differentiate, and it's usually for fire reasons that we want to differentiate between how familiar the people who are staying in that building and living in that building are with the building itself, okay? That makes a difference to how people behave in emergency events and things like that. So we can say that this apartment building, do you think it's a group home?
No.
No. It's really an apartment building where people are going to have permanent residence. They're probably going to purchase the apartment themselves. They could be, they could rent the apartment on, 6 months, 12 month leases is quite common, but more long term, more long term residential. Or if they're owner occupied, they own the apartment and they live there for numbers of years probably. So we're looking for something that's more in line with that type of use, not home-based childcares. Independent unit. Don't get confused with independent unit and apartments. Independent units are more a second dwelling on an SD lot. So you've got the main residence and then you've got an independent unit, so like a granny flat. You know what I mean when I say granny flat? It's a bit of an Australian term, but does everybody know what I'm referring to? It's like the little self-contained bedroom, kitchenette, maybe a living area, that's either often endowed built underneath an elevated house as extra accommodation, but sometimes can be like a structure that's built down at the back of the garden, away from and separated completely from the main dwelling, and we refer to that as an independent unit. It's not to be confused with unit developments and apartments, okay, as a use. And so the next one we come down to is, so for when we're looking for something that actually refers to dwellings, because this is a permanent dwelling, and we've got, oh my gosh, I'm just after hitting that wrong. Multiple dwellings. Where's my sheet gone? I think I've zoomed like a million times. So we've got multiple dwellings. I'm thinking that this is the most likely closest one to our use, but it is up to you, the applicant, to define your use. It doesn't firmly tell you that, and that's why we refer to this, and we refer to the definitions to do that. Okay. You do have to check all the uses because you want to get the one closest to what you're doing. But we can fairly safely say that this will be multiple dwellings. So it's instead of being a single dwelling, as AT1 was, just one house on one lot, this is multiple dwellings on one lot. Okay? The only other dwelling uses down here that we can see, there's supporting accommodation. Supporting accommodation is probably more in line with an old people's nursing home, where everyone's sort of in the same building and they're being looked after in there. And so, and the other dwelling on there, so we can have a single dwelling. So do you see the way that in some of the uses here, we have discretionary or permitted? So the only permitted use on this site is single dwelling, and an independent unit. We can have a home occupation, and we can have home-based contracting, or a group home is also permitted. So business sign is also permitted. Do you think it would be a good use of this lot to just put one house on it? So it's obviously the area of it is 2,280 square meters, so it's rather a large lot to put one single dwelling on it. So you wouldn't really be getting the value of the land in doing that. But also, because it's zoned MR, multi-residential, it's indicating to us that this lot, when it was subdivided and created, the intention was to put more than one dwelling on it. And that's why it was given the zone, multi-residential. And so I don't think it would be an effective use of that land to just go ahead now and put one single dwelling on it. Maybe if you're very, very rich and you don't mind how much money you spend on the land, that would be a good idea. But to get the most profit out of the land, developers will be looking at that land saying an apartment building is the most suitable use on there in accordance with the planning scheme. So let's go back to what we defined. So we want to read in our definitions, we want to read the definition for multiple dwellings. As we can see, before we leave here, we've got the clause numbers that we're going to have to comply with. So multiple dwellings in zone MR is at D, discretionary use. How do we know what D stands for? It's at the bottom of the page, discretionary use. What does discretionary use mean?
That you probably need to get a permit.
So with anything except for a single dwelling, which is a permitted use. So anything outside of that, you'll need a full application. But discretionary use means it's at the discretion of the Development Consent Authority, who we visited on Friday. It's at their discretion whether or not you get a permit or planning consent for this application. Okay? It's a discretionary use. So let's write up all those things. So the use we're going to have in our notes is going to be a multiple dwelling, MD, not to be confused with MR, which is the zone. Okay. Vital pieces of information circled in green there. We can't proceed without either of those two pieces of information. We also have some clause numbers on here, which I'm just going to jot down. So we've got 6.5.1. Who can tell me what 6.5.1 refers to? Parking. Very good. Excellent. Same clause as we looked at for assessment task 1. It just might read a little bit differently for assessment task 2. Because remembering in all those clauses it says, if you have this or if you have that, this happens. So we might read it a little bit with a different perspective when we're thinking about an apartment building. Next clause up is 7.1. What's 7.1, anyone? Nicole? Height and density, fantastic. You can see you all becoming familiar with the planning scheme already. So we got 7.3. Was that in the last one? What's 7.3 relating to? Setbacks. We got 7.4. Don't think we had it last time, 7.5. I could be wrong because I don't always remember. Private open space, we had that before. So please write all this down in your notes, making sure that you've give yourself some tips and direction on where you're going with this application. 7.5, we've got 7.6, 7.7, and 7.8. And we know that we're going to have to read each of those clauses in relation to this particular application to know what we need to comply with. Alrighty. Now the next place I'm going to go is I'm going to go back to my definitions now that I know my use is MD, multiple dwellings. And I'm just going to go back in here into my definitions. I really want to read this definition, MD. I want to know exactly what that means before I go any further. As I said, the definitions are in alphabetical order. I'm just going to keep going to M. So multiple dwellings, the definition under the planning scheme for multiple dwellings means a building or group of buildings on a site which individually or collectively contain more than one dwelling, including serviced apartments, but does not include an independent unit. Okay, so the independent unit, think granny flat, but it doesn't include that, but it does mean that there's a group or a building or a group of buildings. So if you have a group of buildings on a site that are, let's see what sort of place I can refer to here. There's a place in Parap called the Tropicana Apartments. Is anyone familiar with that development? It was supposed to be holiday let apartments, and they were all individual apartments on the ground, but set around a pool in a resort style accommodation. So they would have come under this. They would have come under multiple dwellings, because they're a group of buildings on a site, which collectively contain more than one dwelling. Okay? So it wouldn't necessarily be high-rise apartment building, but it is. That is included in this group, the high-rise apartment buildings, the sort of general buildings that we're all very familiar with. But it can also include groups of buildings that are not in one building, but they must be on the same lot. Is that clear? Get what I mean? Imagine we had a site, we had a lot, and instead of having, this is our lot, and instead of having one building that is a high-rise apartment building, and this is in plan, but that building is tall and it contains multiple dwellings stacked over each other on different stories. Instead of that, if we had, or where we would have, just, let this dry, let me draw on it. If we just had little pods, no, got into my marker. Let that dry out. If each of these was a single apartment or a single unit, and like with the Tropicana, they just have a big swimming pool in the middle and that's your resort. So that could also be classified as a multiple dwelling because it's a group of buildings on a site. Okay? Multiple dwellings, MD. You'll come across this category a lot, so it's important to be quite familiar with it. So I am pretty confident at this point, I hope you'd agree with me, that the information we have on the board there is absolutely what's relevant to this application. And we've checked out our zonings, we've identified the two most important things that we need before we begin any application, the zone and the use. And we've identified the clauses that we need to comply with. If you're there and you're confident in what your decision making is there, you're ready to begin your planning application. But please, that work we've just done over the last hour is absolutely, I can't stress enough what you need to do at the beginning of every application. If you dive into clauses and applications too quickly and you haven't done your due diligence here and done your research of where you need to be in the planning scheme, none of that work matters because you might be heading off in the wrong direction. So this is crucial at the beginning of any application to identify exactly where you're going with it. So, next step, we're going to have a look at our clauses. Actually, the next step I would do when I'm preparing is I would send off for my dial before you dig information. Because we know from doing our planning application for a single dwelling that we're going to need to know where all the service locations are. We also need to think about RFIs. Who might we need to contact? Again, the landscaper, because we're not going to get that information from dial before you dig, are you? And on this job as well, we do have an electrical plan to give you. So just so you're aware, there is an electrical contractor, and he is going to provide you with an electrical layout drawing for the internals of the apartment building. So you might want to prepare some RFIs now and look up your dial before you dig before morning tea. Let's get that part of work done. So that's the next next strategic step that we want to gather information before we look into the actual application itself. So again, you want to update your checklist for this part of the unit. You want to be making a new checklist that lists these particular clauses. And you can call this checklist MD, Multiple Dwellings Checklist. Your documents that you need to provide for the planning application and that checklist that you use for AT1, it remains pretty much the same. You still have the same process. So we're going to have the application form, we're going to have the owner's letter of consent, you're going to have and you know who the owner is from your student assessment guide, you'll have that information there. And you're going to have your statement of effect and your set of documentation. That list doesn't really change. You're happy for you to reuse the same checklist again, but you just need to call this one AT2. And be marking off your documents as you complete them. Your checklist with the clauses will change, and you might want to update that now as well. And your third checklist was the checklist for the list of drawings themselves. Now that checklist may evolve as we move through the application, but I suggest you just make another copy of what we originally used in AT1 and use that for the beginning of the documentation. We will definitely still need a site plan, we'll definitely still need floor plans, elevations, sections, and a landscaping plan. We may or may not require more documents as we go through the clauses. That will become apparent. Okay? Well, I'll give you some time to get all those checklists and get your dial before you dig information sent off. So you can get that information, getting used to using dial before you dig.
We should already have it.
You have already have it. Yeah. Okay. If you don't have the dial before you dig, don't lodge the application online. I have all the dial before you dig information. So just if you can't locate it from your previous units, you should have it from. Where do you remember getting it from, Bridget? In 401?
4006.
Okay. Oh, you did it back then. Okay, fantastic. So if you don't have it, just send me an email and I'll send you the dial before you dig information. So I'm going to give you guys half an hour to get all that paperwork up to where it should be for this application. Get your checklist printed out, have them beside you as you're working through, send me an email if you need the dial before. Actually, what I'm going to do with the dial before you dig is I'm going to upload it to OneDrive. Do you have RFIs?
I was going to say
I'll go off and get the blank copies of the RFIs and give you those as well. So you can write off to
who we need to send.
the landscaping plan. You can use the names and addresses I gave you for AT1.
Yeah.
So the landscaping and electrical. Those are the only two RFIs you need for this one.
Not mechanical.
No, because you're going to get the connection points from the dial before you dig this time, whereas that wasn't available to us for AT1. So just 2 RFIs, okay?
What's the location of the economy?
It's on some drawings that we already have.
And not to worry about geotechnical?
We don't have one to give you this time around. So normally you would look for your geotech, but I don't have one to give you.
And fire?
Fire, we have to think about on this one, yeah. But actually, fire doesn't come into planning. Okay, so fire will be in the next unit, all about building certification. We'll have to be thinking about the fire there. So what we know about fire from the NCC is that we have to have separation from the boundaries for fire. 3-meter rule that we're 3 meters off the boundary, which is a bit more excessive than the planning. But let's just follow the setbacks for planning for now, and we'll deal with that in the next unit, okay? Because I don't want to confuse the two things. I want to be very, very clear that what you're doing here is complying with planning regulation, and what you'll do in the next unit, you're complying with NCC for working drawings. Okay? It is a bit of a shame in a real job if you comply strictly with planning and then realise that you're still too close to the boundary for your fire regs. So in reality, you would be addressing both of those issues at this point in the project, but you're just learning, so let's not confuse things too much. Let's go step by step, and we'll come to that issue when we come to it. Those are the sorts of things you learn by experience. Okay, I'll get you the RFIs. Okay, so next port of call after we've done our RFIs and got those filled out, and I'll respond to them later today. I didn't get a chance there now. Too much talk about cameras. But once we've sent off our requests for information, the RFIs, and we know that we're sending them to 2 people this time. We're sending to the landscaper because we want to get a landscape plan. We know that we'll have to create a landscape drawing as part of our documentation, so we want to get that information in nice and early. And the second one that we're going to look at is for the electrician. There's an electrical plan available, so we're just going to request a copy of that. Now, with the electrical plan, it's more the one, and I have had a look at it. The one that electrical plan has done up is more internal electrics, so it's showing the fans and the light switches and the lights and that sort of thing. You don't need that. It's not a requirement for planning, so I'm not asking you to draw fans and all that onto your documentation set at this stage. But we know that we will need all of the site connection points for services. We'll have to show that as we did in AT1. So we definitely want the dial before you dig information, and at this point in time I have shared with you the dial before you dig information on your OneDrive. So you've also got all of that information too. But back to the planning scheme and back to our clauses. You've got your checklist done up now for the MR zone and the MD use, the multiple dwelling use, and with that use we've identified the clauses as are written up on the board there, and we're going to go through them one at a time to see what it is exactly in the planning scheme that we want to comply with. What is the planning scheme going to tell us to do? So we'll start off, we'll go numerical order, so we'll start with the 6.5.1. And we read 6.5.1 for AT1 because it was about car parking. And you'll find that 6.5.1 is referenced, as you can see, just look down the list there. It's referenced in almost every use, apart from, say, home occupation. So, vehicle parking. My magnifying glass to read all this. Yep, so it's going to be pretty similar. I just want to read through the clause and make sure we know where we're going with this. So 6.5.1 in your planning scheme. The purpose of this clause is to ensure that sufficient off-street car parking is constructed to a standard and conveniently located and is provided to service the proposed use of the site. Okay, so the subclause is the 5.5.2. If a use or development specified in column 1 of the table, which we'll look at in a moment, the number of car parks is rounded up to the next whole number. We've already looked at that before. Required for that use or development is to be calculated in accordance with the formula. So, yes, if there's a proposed use or development which is not listed in the table to this clause, requires consent, the number of car parking spaces is determined by the consent authority, the DCA. Those people that we met on Friday. And a car park is designed in accordance with 6.5.3. And we're going to have a look at 6.5.3 today to see what constitutes a car park, you know. Like I could give you, you know, a 1 by 1 meter square little slot and say that's a car park, but it's not the standard car park size as determined by the planning scheme. And so there's also a few other little rules around how a car park is designed. We didn't have to worry about that so much for AT1, because on AT1 you can drive your car into the front yard of your house and reverse it back out the gate onto the street, and we don't need to have turning and we don't need to have widths of driveways or anything like that. It's just sufficient to say that our garage provided those 2 car parks. But when we get into an apartment building and we're actually starting to design an actual car park where multiple cars are turning and parking, and we certainly don't want everybody in an apartment building reversing out onto the road, we have to start looking at the car park design in a bit more detail as well. So let's have a look at the table. Again, we've got our use or development over here. on the left-hand side there, and we're going to go down until we find our multiple dwellings. And we've got multiple dwellings here. Everybody find that in the planning scheme? Multiple dwellings, it's 2 per dwelling. Well, we don't need to worry about this column, because if we go back up to the top, we can see that that column, way too far. Damn. So that column is about, this is the minimum number of car parking spaces required, column 2 in general, and the minimum number of car parking spaces required within zone CB. We're not within zone CB, we've identified our zone as MR. So we're only looking at this column, the center column, column 2, and we know that when we get down to multiple dwellings, page, multiple dwellings, we're at 2 per dwelling. Okay? So what does 2 per dwelling mean to us in the context of an apartment building? What would it mean to you, Andy? I said we need to provide 2 car parks per dwelling. Yes, for every one unit, for every single dwelling within a multiple dwelling unit development. So 2 per apartment. Doesn't mention anything about visitor car parking here. I don't know how many of you live or know an apartment building that has visitor car parking. So obviously if you go to visit someone who lives in a unit, you have a choice of either parking out on the street or sometimes apartment buildings do provide visitor parking additional to the 2 car parks per unit. So how many of you know, I don't know what the name of that street is now. There's a street in Tipperary Waters. Do you know where all the fishing boats are? Do you know where Flying Nemo is? Fish and chip shop? Down around Tipperary Waters. Well, there's a street down there that it's a cul-de-sac at the end. It runs right along sort of the old wharf where the fish and chip shop is. But the street there, it's got lots of apartment buildings on it, and it is probably the most congested street in Darwin if you ever drive down there, because that whilst they've provided the 2 car parking spaces per unit, they haven't allowed for any sort of visitor parking. And can you imagine if everyone in all of those apartments just has one visitor, one carload of people that comes to visit, you know, Saturday evening, the weekends, whatever, when people tend to visit each other, that street is unbelievable. There's cars parked at every angle and every direction, and you can barely get down and turn your car around and come back up again because of this, because they haven't allowed for any sort of visitor car parking. You don't have to. Strict compliance with the planning scheme says 2 per dwelling. That is the minimum number you should provide. I would absolutely advise you, though, if you're doing apartment buildings, to provide at least 3 or 4 visitor car parks within the complex, within the boundaries of the site. Rather than having all the visitor car parking on the street, because it doesn't work so well for especially streets where there is lots of different apartment buildings on the same street. There's a number of these streets, and I don't see it so much in the CBD because they tend to get serviced with, you know, multi-storey car parks, but you see it out towards Tipperary Waters is a good example. Also, there's an area in Woolner that has a lot of apartment buildings, you know, up on the hill in Woolner. And there's a couple of cul-de-sac streets in around there, just off Bishop Street, that are very congested as well because of this issue. Okay, so 2 per dwelling. Checklist should simply say 2 per dwelling as per your single dwelling unit. Okay? Now, I just want to follow down a little bit more and talk a little bit more about car parking in the context of, I'll zoom back out or I'll be all day. So 6.5.2 talks about the reduction in car park requirements. And so I am assuming at this point in time that on our ground floor level, because the whole level has been given over to car park design, that we will have sufficient car parking there. We'll have to do the calculation later on when we look at our drawings. So maybe quickly, how many apartments do we have in the building? 9. How many car parks do we have in the car park? Units and 19 car parks. Is that confirmed yet? 19 car parks. So we need 18 to comply with the planning scheme, don't we? 2 by 9, 18. And we have 1 extra car park. There's a couple of considerations here. Under the planning scheme, it doesn't mention anywhere in the planning scheme that you need to provide a disabled accessible car park. However, the National Construction Code does refer to that. So I would be saying that I would have that extra car park as a disabled accessible car park. However, your disabled accessible car park can count towards the 19, or towards the 18. Okay? So it's not saying that, you know, we've got 18 everyday car parks and 1 extra is the disabled car park, and that's my 19. But I would assume that that's the way it is done in this building, because they will want to give 2 fully usable car parks for each unit. So if you move into a unit and you're paying the rent, you kind of want to have 2 car parks, and you don't want to find out that everybody else in the building does have 2 car parks and you only have 1. And so then to provide a disabled accessible car park, they've probably added that as an additional extra car parking. But it certainly does count towards the total. So if you're ever in a situation where you're short on space to provide car parking, and that happens all the time in planning applications, you can count the disabled car park towards your total. Okay, just so you know that. Let's look at so the purpose of this clause, the 6.5.2, which isn't on our list, but we're just going to have a look at it today anyway, so we're familiar with it. The purpose of this clause is to provide for a use or development with fewer car parking spaces than required by clause 6.5.1. The consent authority may approve a use or development with fewer car parking spaces than is required by 6.5.1 if it is satisfied that a reduction is appropriate for the use or development, having considered all of the following matters: the zoning of the land, the use of development, and the future use or development of the land, the provision of car parking spaces in the vicinity of the land. So we heard quite a bit about this on Friday, where, which application was it now? Where the Woolies application, where they were doing the change of use to a bar there. So normally every application generates some requirement for car parking. But, you know, if you've got Woolies building in the centre of the CBD and it's built to the boundaries, as it should be, you know, we don't want the CBD all given over to car parking, then the Development Consent Authority can refer to this part of the planning scheme. It's where they, I've lost it now, where they look at the provision of car parking spaces in the vicinity of the land. So what they will do in the CBD is say, well, there's like ample on-street car parking in the CBD, and there's also the provision of public facilities for multi-storey car parking in the CBD. Okay? Now what happens, so this clause 6.5.2 gives the DCA the right to reduce the car parking in the CBD, so that's the DCA agreeing to that. However, what will happen to your application is that City of Darwin will say, well, we provide the car parking, we run the multi-storey car parks, we provide all the on-street car parking and do all the line marking, and we pay the parking, what are their names? Inspectors, the people who come around and give you a ticket if you're illegally parked. They pay their wages, so they manage that whole system in an area like that and in other areas too. So so City of Darwin say to the DCA, so if you have, your planning scheme wants to provide 18 as the minimum number of the planning scheme, and say, for instance, you can only provide 15, we want a payment from that developer, from your client, from whoever you're representing as an applicant. We want a payment towards the communal car parking. So the on-street car parking and the multi-storey car parks, this money that is charged for every car park that you are below the required amount, this money is payable to City of Darwin or City of Palmerston if you're out in that area. And it's not I don't know what, I can't remember exactly what the charge is right now, but the last time I was doing applications, it was up around 6,000 or 7,000 per car park that you were shortfall. It's a lump sum, not an ongoing fee. It's a lump sum that your client or your development needs to pay to City of Darwin once off. It's not an ongoing fee, which is quite good. But once off payment at the time of your planning application, they need to pay this to City of Darwin. I've certainly looked at applications in the CBD where they were paying hundreds of thousands. So they had no car parking and they were paying hundreds of thousands as the shortfall fee to City of Darwin. It's not to the Development Consent Authority, but it's City of Darwin do the charge for shortfall in car parking. So just be wary of that. Even though this clause is in here, and it gives you the right, it gives the DCA the right to allow or give you consent for your application with a shortfall in car parking, there are fees to be paid. And you need to warn your client of that. You need to talk to City of Darwin about what the fees will be, and then you need to certainly advise your client that there are going to be fees.
That's funny unique to me because the planner was really trying to justify the parking and then it kind of turned out it wasn't necessary or something. Is that
For which application was this?
for the Woolies building?
The Woolies building.
Wasn't it that?
Yeah, he started to talk about it and she sort of stopped him and said
Like,
that, yeah, that wasn't an issue in the
Yeah,
CBD.
yeah.
Yeah, and they would.
and then, like you were saying something about the tariffs and cover the fees and.
So what he was talking about there obviously is an agreement on that particular building. It's quite, and this isn't a normal occurrence at all. So do you remember a couple of years ago that Woolies building was just cladding? There was no windows, there was no shops around that first floor level at all, and at that time, Guello Developments, the developer that we were talking to there on Friday, they actually have, and he actually flicked through that document. He said he wasn't going to lodge it as part of the application, but there was a document on his desk where he's flicking through, and it's a high-rise building. It's a really high-rise building. It's
Yeah, like an eggy.
it looked like like the Shard in London or something like that. It looked like inspiration taken from something like that. So a very significant CBD building for Darwin, okay? And that is their long-term proposal for that site. However, they went to the planners and said, look, this isn't economically viable to build this building in Darwin right now. But however, to help the government and City of Darwin to regenerate the city and not have a big disused building right in the city centre, it's such a significant site, that they would activate the street front, okay? So again, all these terms that we need to be familiar with. So activating the street front. And so they very quickly and very cheaply and temporarily put in those shops that are on the Woolies building. So it seems to me that, remember the first application, the item 4 that was there on Friday, was an extension. So what they were given permission to do that for a period of time. Now that doesn't usually happen. Normally things are given permission. That's what they've been given permission. If you want to change the use later on, you do a whole other application to change the use. But that's a very strange application that it's got a time limit on it. And item 4 on Friday was trying to extend that time limit. So they can keep it as it is for now. And then the item 5, their second application, was to do the first floor, put in the bar and activate the building even more at first floor level. So where she stopped him, because he started to talk about, there's obviously some sort of payment tariff that is ongoing for that in that situation, for the car parking. No, it's the fee. Yeah, sorry, it's this. No, it's this. It's the shortfall in parking. So I'd say what happened back then was, because it was a temporary application, they said, well, we're not going to pay all these car parking fees as if it was an application that was going to be given that use forever. We're only going to pay a percentage of it. There was probably a negotiation done there, and it sounds like theirs is a tariff or a fee that's ongoing. And so they said, we'll continue the tariff fees ongoing as per the original agreement. They weren't going to increase that in any way.
But, so they were saying, we're talking about something 7 years or something, wasn't it? It was 7 or 6 years. So this is limit to 7 years.
Yeah, that they were, yeah.
Does that mean that
Yeah.
they wanted to get rid of that rule. Is that right? Like they wanted to. No time. Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't. They just wanted it to stay as is currently with the shop fronts, the activation of at street level, and the first floor development. They wanted to stay like that. They're not going to propose, or there's no limitation on time of when they need to propose this really big high-rise building.
Yeah.
Because of the current economic situation.
I was just thinking that the client or whoever, the developer or business who wants to develop it, that they have got like a 7-year cutoff.
No, that was put on by the planners. Yeah. Yeah. And I was a bit surprised they didn't put a new time limit on it. I thought they may have given them another 7 years and then revisited it then, because things can change dramatically in 7 years. But what if they leave it like that forever?
Yeah, well,
this is the thing, like, do we want that Woolies building in the city centre forever? No, you kind of want to be having milestones that when we get there we're going to look at it again and go, right, well, because the way that they can force the developer to do the large development that they, you know, we all as a city would really want to see in terms of progress. What we don't want to see is in 25 years' time that the Woolies building still sits there and he's getting enough rent out of those shops to not develop it and not bother, and you're not giving him an incentive to develop the site, whereas the time limit was always going to act as an incentive. When that's running out, then the DCA can say, no, you've got to close all those shops. That's the power they can have. They go, no, your planning's, you know, it's illegal what you're doing. We're going to revoke the planning on that, and now you're left with an empty ex-Woolies building again, and now the incentive to develop is much, much greater.
So it's, well, I
yeah, yeah, they do. Yeah. I as a developer, I really quite like Gwello. I worked with them on Jacana House, which was Darwin's first 5-star Green Star building. They are, Evan, the man I was talking to on Friday, is he's a developer with a lot of he looks at the future of the city, and he's certainly not afraid of energy efficiency or sustainability. I find him really has got an open mind, and he wants to develop Darwin in a very sensitive but also in a very good long-term way for Darwin. He's been a long-term, I think he's originally from Northern Europe, some Scandinavian country, I'm not quite sure which one, but he's lived in Darwin since he was a young man himself, and he's quite passionate about Darwin. And certainly when I worked with him on Jacana House, when I work with other developers on sustainability, all they ever think about is the cost to them, the initial cost to them in the capital, and they're quite quick to go, no, we're not doing that, no, we're not doing that. But he's really, he can really see the benefits, and he made massive money out of Jacana House. I forget the figures. So Jacana House is an office building on Wood Street. Do you know where Pendanus is, the hotel? So it's on the same block as that. There's 4 buildings there on the corner. I'll get my Google Maps up and I'll show it to you.
But if he's Scandinavian, he's probably got a lot of good ideas from
Yeah.
Scandinavia.
Yeah. He's absolutely open to lots of things. So I find him quite good to work with. Marianne has also worked with him on a number of occasions, and she says the same thing. He's just, he's not all, a lot of developers you meet are all in it for the money. But he's one who's. So we've got, where am I? Wood Street, Nookie Street. So there's 4 buildings. Post office, yeah, okay. So it doesn't really show me the 4 buildings. Sorry, I have to go back to Google Earth. I should have went to Google Earth. Oh, shoot. This one. How do I get to images?
Maybe.
I should be able to get in on maps, though, go between satellite.
Yeah.
Here we go. Okay. So it's Wood Street, runs up along here. So in Darwin, for those who are quite new, so we've got McMinn, Wood Street, Kavanagh Street. It's up around Energy House where we went to the meeting on the Monday. and then we got Mitchell Street, and we got the Esplanade all the way down here. So you got these really long streets, so you really need to get to know them. You need to know the Esplanade, Mitchell Street, Smith Street, Kavanagh Street, and Wood Street, and McMinn Street. If you know those streets, you start knowing the city quite well. So in here, on Nucky Street and Wood Street, you've got a really high tower here. It's called Pendanus. It's the second highest building in the Darwin CBD. This is the highest one here, which is Evolution. This is actually the highest, but it's further down the hill to this one. So when you look at the skyline, they look pretty much the same height, but this one's actually taller. So this is Pendanus. This is Litchfield Apartments. So you know the building that they were talking about, the Cameo Gifts and Hardware? This is Cameo Gifts and Hardware, a very low building here. And that's what I was saying, the people in the Litchfield Apartments are going to be looking out on all the lovely condensers here, and there's an apartment building here as well. But then you've got, this is actually Jacana House here. So when you're driving into the city, you actually see the front of Jacana House. Now, I'm not saying Jacana House isn't the most attractive building in the world to look at. It looks, I don't know, how would I say? It looks a bit grey and a bit like a standard building. But Jacana House is by far the most efficient building in Darwin in terms of energy consumption. There's some great innovation that went on in Jacana House. It's a very well insulated building, very, very thought about facade. When it was built, I believe they don't have it anymore, and it doesn't look like it is here now, but when it was built, it had a green roof, a grass roof on it. It's got a huge tank built inside it that stores water. And so how the mechanical system works is that it cools during the night. It cools the water during the night to be chilled water. Why we do this? Because there's less heat load on a system during the night, because the heat temperatures are down and you don't have the radiant heat. So it uses less energy to cool the same volume of water, and then that water is kept in a very big insulated tank, and that gets circulated around the building during the day to provide the cooling. So it's a very quite sophisticated building. We have a similar system here at CDU. There's a huge water tank, chilled water tank up at the top of the site, so it gets pumped around the buildings during the day, but it gets cooled overnight. So lots of interesting things about Jacana House, and that was all of this. Litchfield Apartments, Pendanus, and this, and what was called Wood Street 1, this building in here, that you can't really see because it's in the shade of the Pendanus Tower. And those four buildings were built in and around the same period, over a period of a number of years, because it's quite a big development, all by Gwello. They've also done Coolalinga Shopping Centre. Where Gwello really, I suppose, came out of being, came to be a large developer was the CASCOM. The offices here in Casuarina, behind Casuarina Square. So there's a couple of government offices there. Sorry, I'll drop all my... Behind Casuarina Village, behind Coles there. So if you drive that road, I'll show you where it is. So before we leave the city, I'm also going to show you this building here, this really high-rise building here. Is the Oaks Elan Apartments in Darwin, the hotel, service apartments. That was also built by Gwello, and this will again just reaffirm. So this is the highest building in the world. If you Google this building, it's called Soho. And if you Google Soho Darwin, it should give you an article, or I can share the article with you about how this was built. So this building was built a little bit like the building in Casuarina, the student accommodation, where it was built in pods. And this is the highest building in the world built with pod construction.
And they bolted together.
And they bolted them together, yeah. And they came in so fully fitted. All the bathrooms were all already installed in the pods. Brought them in from overseas. Now, it wasn't a particularly popular method of construction because a lot of local tradies were giving out murders that, all the work was being done overseas and brought in pods. But this is the tallest building in the world. And so Soho is the name of the actual building. I'm pretty sure there's a Korean restaurant in the bottom there. I don't know if you've ever been to that restaurant. It's quite nice. So along the street frontage, there's a couple of restaurants and all in the building, but above that, there's apartments. Did you find that article?
Irwin Consultant's got a whole...
Irwin Consult will have a whole thing on it, because that's where I've read all about it before. Yeah. So Irwin Consult were the structural engineers on it. So quite interesting for Darwin, you know, because we don't think that, you know, totally believe that, you know, at least 95% of our population walk past that building and think absolutely nothing of it, but it's actually a really big feat of engineering. And again, that was Gwello. So Coolalinga, you know, I remember when I started first working in Darwin and people said Coolalinga was going to be the new centre, and people just laughed, you know, they were like, Coolalinga, you joking me, that's out in the rural area, that'll never be anything out there. And Gwello took it on, built the new shopping centre, but also built, you know, the apartment buildings behind and got that land rezoned to be MD or MR, so they could actually build apartments and smaller houses out there. And sort of that's in line with what Del Batten was talking to us about you know, bringing little pockets of development out into the rural area so that, you know, when people get older and they're living on a 2-hectare block and they just can't look after it anymore, they don't have to move into Palmerston or into the city. They can buy an apartment or a small townhouse in the rural area and continue to live in the rural area around the community that they've known and loved all their lives. And that's important. And you'll also get lots of demographics of different people in the population who grew up in the rural area. They don't want to move into an urban area, but they can't afford to buy the 2-hectare block, or maybe just don't want to, you know. But they do want to live with the community they grew up with. So it's important that we get a mix of development out into the rural area. And Coolalinga certainly did bring that out there. I'll just show you the buildings I'm talking about in Casuarina. So in Casuarina we've got, this is all Casuarina Square, and then you've got the Casuarina Village shopping centre in here. But then all these buildings were known as Cascom, and they're all office buildings, most of them, and most of them house government tenancies. So Gwello was very much at the forefront. So he didn't just build buildings; he built buildings that he had already secured government leases on, and has been very, you know, provided the government with and met their needs of accommodation for their workers, but also made himself a tidy profit out of it. So Jacana House, 5-star Green Star building. All the federal government agencies, so not the NT government, the federal government of Australia, have different departments and agencies, and the federal government brought in a policy, can't remember how long ago, maybe it was a decade ago, that all their office buildings needed to be 5-star Green Star. And there wasn't a 5-star Green Star building in Darwin at the time. There was quite a few being built in other capital cities, but there was none in Darwin. Gwello identified that need, came to us at Irwin Consult when I was working there, and worked with him to build this 5-star Green Star office building that is Jacana House. And what he did, because the other developers were so, we wouldn't be able to build that in Darwin. That's too futuristic for us, you know, it will never happen, and there was too much negativity around it. I really appreciate Evan in that respect. He doesn't have the negativity, he just finds a way to do it. He finds a solution. He's definitely solution driven, and he worked on that, secured like 10, 20-year leases of the federal government agencies in Darwin. They're all in there now, and will be in there. And when he had them all in, he sold the building, and if you look up Jacana House, what it was sold for, it'll tell you on the internet. He made an absolute fortune. From what I know, it cost him a fortune to build it, but what he was able to sell it for then, a couple of years later, with all those tenants in place, with long-term leases, he just made a massive profit out of it. So I would say a very clever developer, but one that's not afraid of innovation and new things. So, yeah. That's our Minica house. Yeah, no, I thought it was more than 10. Yeah, Jacana House was 60 in June 2017. Yeah, 60 million.
16 or 50?
60. I think at the time it was sold, it was the most expensive building in Darwin, Jacana House. Yeah, but that's because of the sophistication of the building. It's not just, you know, bricks and mortar. It's about the services and the efficiencies of it, and the tenancies that it's got secured. Like, you can't get a better tenant than a federal government tenant. You just can't.
And Cascom for 34 million.
Cascom sold for 34? Yeah, yeah. Yes.
So he must have a lot of money.
Lots of money. Lives in a lovely house in Cullen Bay. But they spoke to me on Friday about, you know, how passionate he is about the CBD and the revitalisation of it, and, you know, so he's always looking for a way to improve Darwin. He's been around a long time. He did Cullen Bay. All that reclamation of land and all was all one of his projects. Yep. Yeah. So has done quite a few really quite significant projects around with his own money, with his own investment. He does have a partner, Bernie. I can't remember what Bernie's surname is, but not as in a wife partner, a business partner. He's a gentleman, Bernie. He was actually sitting there. He was in the second row, a large man at the DCA. He doesn't say a whole lot. I don't know Bernie that well.
I thought, you know, it was the public who has lodged the submission.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
No, that's his business partner. Yes. He was sitting in beside him. Yes.
No, I thought that they were going to like say something.
No,
Okay.
he's the business partner. Yeah.
Oh.
Alrighty, where was I? Before that? Can't even remember. Oh yeah, so we were talking about, we started all that off talking about reduced parking numbers. Sometimes I don't know how we get to where we get to, but that's all right. It's all infill information, and it's good for you to hear all this. It's really good for you. It mightn't quite be the core of what we're doing, but it's really good for you in what's ahead of you. So yes, just to note on that, if there is a reduction in car parking requirements, then you do need to think about the cost that you're going to have to pay to the City of Darwin. And it's always worth, because they change the fees on it all the time, but it is quite a substantial fee. Maybe they've reduced it a bit now, I'm hoping, with a bit of downturn in the construction industry, but you know they tend to do that with their tariffs. But if you're doing a planning application, before you advise, and you do have a car parking shortfall, I advise you to call City of Darwin, find out what the current fees are for each car park that you're below the requirement, and be able to advise your client of the cost to the project that's going to be, if that is the case, if you're the one preparing the application. All right, car parking layout. The purpose of this clause, sorry?
Sorry. Actually, they have to fix the car park because they have two bedrooms.
Mm-hmm.
They have 3 bedrooms.
Yeah.
So they put more than one extra.
No, because it says 2 per dwelling.
Yeah, but the other here in Colin.
Yeah, so remember we said this is only in the CB zone, and our zone isn't CB, our zone is MR. So that column doesn't apply to us. We have to go with this middle column. Okay? But you're right, you do get a bit of a reduction if you're in the CB zone, if you're doing an apartment building in the city centre. You would. And again, that's because in the city centre, we've got a lot of ample on-street parking, and a lot of people walk to work. You know, they live in the CBD and they just walk to work and maybe don't own a car at all. So it's a different style of living. But out where we are with this development, out at Villaflor Crescent in Woolner, it's pretty much a given that people are going to own a car and want to drive in and out of to their workplace. They're not in close proximity to big, larger urban areas. Probably walk a distance to Parap, but that's about it. Okay, layout. The purpose of this clause is to ensure that the car parking area is appropriately designed, constructed and maintained for its intended purpose. So it's very important. So you can't provide a car park that's like just loose gravel. Your car park, and we all know of standard car parks as bitumen car parks, but that wasn't always the way, you know. Even back when I started working, you could actually provide just compacted gravel car parks. This is definitely back in Ireland. I have never seen that here, but you know, you could do that, and that was an acceptable car park. But the planning scheme, the NT says no, it can't be. So what does it tell us a car park needs to be? A car park area is to be of suitable gradient for safe and convenient car parking. So you can't, decide that, you've got a hill like this on your site, and the hill is going to be the car park, and you line mark it all nicely, but you expect people to park their cars, or on the side, or so it has to be a suitable gradient, flat enough. Now you can park, cars can take some level of, gradient, but they are designed for that. They do drive up hills and down hills, but our car park is to be relatively flat. And of course, they need to be sealed, which in technical terms basically means you're going to put bitumen. We all know what bitumen is? Yeah. So you know the covering that you see on most car parks and on most roads is called bitumen. B-I-T-U-M-E-N. Or concrete. Concrete is also a seal and impervious, basically, topping on your car park. Okay? So when I said bitumen, you're going to be with me on the bitumen. In Ireland, they call it tar. What do they call it in Estonia? Bitumen. Tar is the actual, the black stuff that they use to bind the aggregate, the stone in it. So the correct term is bitumen, but I do know in Ireland it's referred to as just tar on the road. So I was just wondering, I'm not quite sure of where you guys are from, what you might refer to that as, but I just need you to know what that is. Asphalt is another name that can be used. There's a couple of names for it across the globe, but in Australia we generally call it the bitumen. Everybody knows what it is? Sharon, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay, fantastic. It's just a new word that we probably haven't come across too much before. So it must be sealed and well drained, and sealed just means impervious, and bitumen concrete is that. Be functional and provide separate access to every car parking space. So in other words, you can't park a car and then have another car park directly behind that, so that when this car parks, this one can't get out. Okay? So that does happen in America. It happens quite a bit. They have what they call stacked car parks. So what were we going to say?
Well, my sister's unit in Sydney.
In Sydney, do they?
Park.
Yeah.
Flatmate, he parked in you, and then
she
can't park. I'm like, how'd you get out?
You have to somebody has to go and let them out. Yeah. So some units in some more overcrowded cities, they do tend to park right behind each other, but we're not allowed to do that in the NT. Okay. Good thing too. Limit the number of access points to the road, so they don't want this scenario, or you won't be allowed to do this. So sometimes space can get really tight on your site. So if this is our lot and this is our road, you're not allowed to provide your car parks here and put a fence maybe along here, and then every single car has to reverse out onto the road when it wants to leave. This is a public road. You're not allowed to do this. You must bring a road into your site and have car parks on either side of your road that you have. And the turning and the manoeuvring all happens in here on your site. Even though they wouldn't call this on-street car parking because it's on your site, it still requires the public road for manoeuvring in and out of each car parking space, and you're not allowed to do this. Planning scheme tells us in this that you must limit the number of access points to the road, so that would not be limiting the number of access points to the road, that would be putting an access point to the road on every single car parking space. So you must allow a vehicle to enter and exit to a road in a forward gear. In other words, again, this isn't allowed because you would have to reverse back out onto the road. And similarly, you're not allowed to even have all these car parks in your site and not have any turning point here. So you're not allowed to have the car reversing back out of this car park and then reversing all the way out here. Wouldn't be allowed. It is allowed in your single dwellings. You can just drive the car up onto the driveway or into the garage and reverse back out onto the street, but not allowed for apartment buildings or any other type of development either. Why is it not allowed? Because 6.5.3 tells us it's not. Okay, so maximize sight lines for drivers entering or exiting the car parking area. Sight lines are all about, if you're, I'm going to draw a better diagram. let's say this is our site, and this is the public road, right? And I just tried to draw a bend there for safety's sake. And you have your little car here, and you're going to be exiting onto the public road. A sight line is generally taken from the midpoint here, and it's taken from what you can see directly. How far can you see down through the center of the road if you're sitting in the car there? That's what a sight line is. It's not a S-I-T line, as in the sight. It's S-I-G-H-T. It's sight as in what you can see. How far can I see from that point when I'm in my car? If I look down the road, can I see? Okay, so this comes up in planning certainly all over the world, and for instance in Ireland in the planning scheme there's a certain distance you have to be able to see to be allowed to have an entry or an entrance at a certain point on a site. Okay, so don't confuse the sight lines with the building site. It's to do with how far you can view or see. So maximize, and all it says in the NT plan scheme is maximize. It doesn't actually give us the distance on the sight lines, but if you ever are working in other jurisdictions, it may give you distances versus sight lines for drivers entering or exiting the parking area. Be not less than, oh yes, so this is important. So be not less than 3 meters from the road. The area between the car parking area and the road is to be landscaped with a species designed to lessen the visual impact of the car parking area. And this came up on Friday as well when we went to the DCA. Do you remember there was an application for, what was that for?
The Winnelli, the landscaping strip, the proposed landscaping.
Yes, so they wanted a 3 meter strip, and the guy had said, oh, I've been out to the site and you won't be able to provide that many car parks with the 3 meters there, which I find it was a bit of a weird thing for him to say, because all your plans are to scale, so if it's drawn on a plan to scale, then it should fit. So it was a bit of a random, and they kind of offered to give him a reduction in car parking figures over it, but that's not always the best thing, because as we know now that we have to pay fees for every car park that we get reduced. So even if the DCA thinks that's a good idea, your client may not. So what it means, so I think on that one we had a lot, this is often quite common, and you've got maybe a building back here. Let's say your building is, sorry, the board is wet. Let me draw. So let's say this is our building here. It can be a shop, can be a warehouse, doesn't matter what it is. And then we have an entrance maybe here onto a public road. And then we're going to put our car parking like this. You do have to leave a certain distance between the building and the first car park. And so what they're saying is that they want an area here that is 3 meters, and they want this to be the last car park. So that's going to be your entrance road in here. And that this area is going to be landscaped, okay? They don't want the car parks, so you could get an extra car park in here and here if you ever are driving in the old, Winnelli, Berrima. That's what they used to do. They used to have the car parks right down to the entrance, and it's actually a really difficult car park to get in and out of, because it's very tight. You drive in and you sort of have to turn and reverse in or drive in. It's difficult to get into those car parks. But also what it means is when you drive along, Winnelli is a very good example, Coonawarra Road, somewhere like that, the older developments, all you see on either side of the road are cars. That's what you're seeing, car parks in front of businesses. So in order to screen that and to give the areas a bit of more visual amenity, The new scheme, or the newest scheme, looks at providing this 3-metre buffer zone between the fence line and the first car park. Okay? And that's what this is asking us to do here. So the car park itself cannot be less than 3 metres from a road. The area between the car park and the road is to be landscaped with a species designed to lessen the visual impact of the car parking area. So be in accordance with the dimensions set out in the diagram to this clause, which we're going to have a look at now. Have driveways with a minimum width of 6 metres for two-way traffic flow or 3.5 metres for one-way traffic flow. Can you write that into the comments on your checklist? That you must have the road width, because we are going to have to design a road in our car park at the ground floor level of this apartment building. We have to have, this is the first time I suppose we've ever looked at designing internal roads on the site. And that's your guidance there that tells you the width, the minimum width your road has to be, your driveway or your road. So it's I have driveways with a minimum width of 6 metres for two-way traffic flow or 3.5 for one-way traffic flow. And on J there, be designed so that the parking spaces at the end of and perpendicular to the driveway be either 3.5 wide or so that the driveway projects 1 metre beyond the last car park. So what it was I saying here, that there needs to be a gap between the last car park and the building, because what it means in terms of the planning scheme is that that distance needs to be 3.5 metres. So in standard car park, size is, we'll look at this, it's on the diagram. So your standard car park size is 2.5 metres wide. And 5 metres long. Okay? But what it's saying is the car park at the end, this one, even though the car park itself is 2.5 metres wide, the end one has to allow space at 3.5 to the next nearest obstacle, whether that's a building or a fence, you know, a loading zone, whatever it is. There has to be 3.5 metres wide on the last car park. The spaces at the end of and that are perpendicular to the driveway. Or you can do this kind of setup. This is our road. So this is two-way. I want to get that more even. So these are all 2.5. And instead of making this one 3.5, you can just make the road extend 1 metre. Okay? So what that means is when you're in this car park and you're reversing out, if the road ended just there, you would have to reverse out this way. But now you've got the option to reverse that way and drive forward. It acts as a bit of a turning buffer at the end. Okay? So that wouldn't be possible. Well, it is, because what it's doing is saying that if you're, so you normally you'd line mark the 2.5 and you just leave this as a gap. So when the person parks in here, they can actually reverse in that direction to be able to drive forwards out. It's in the drawings.
Yeah, but Katie.
So yeah, so it says in the zoning table that we have to comply with 6.5.1, which isn't this. However, we do have to design the car park, and I always think that's a flaw in our zoning table, that it actually should just say 6.5, and then we'd have to comply with all of 6.5, because I could just easily say you don't need to comply with this and leave it all out, but then you'd never know how to design a car park to be compliant, and certainly when it goes in for application, they would pull you up on this if it wasn't designed. Yes, yeah, on your drawings it'll be important to dimension these particular things that the planner are looking for. Yeah, absolutely. So the diagram to clause 6.5.3 does start to show you a couple of different parking layouts, which you can have a look at. I just never think this document is particularly clear. Where you sent, Sabina, you saw the...
In our actual drawings, or
yes, in your actual drawings it shows the 1 metre extension on your concept one. So I don't bother too much. You don't need to look at these diagrams in particular for R82, but I thought there was one in there with the 1 metre at the end of the diagram that I hadn't seen, but I never like these in particular. I think they really need to update their diagrams to reflect what they're saying in the text, because this doesn't really tell me that. It's just telling me different widths of roads, and it's more about street parking. It's more about like on-street parking, whether it's 90 degrees perpendicular or what we call angled car parking, and what distance you need for an angled car park to be 6 meters out from this curb line away from the building, and then how your street needs to be like 10.5. But you know, in reality, none of us are going to put in a street that's 10.5 meters wide into our development unless it's a huge site. You know, when we're thinking of an apartment building, we're going to try and keep the area that we give over for roads and turning to the minimum possible, and the minimum is those minimums that we wrote down on your comments box there, that the road has to be 6 meters wide or 3.5 if in one-way direction. When we look at the warehouse development, we might have a bit more look at this, but we won't for 82. And it's giving you just some minimum dimensions there for angled car parking. It depends on the angle of the car park. So this is at 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees. It depends on the width you have available. Okay, so I think that diagram could be madly improved, but that's all we need to do for car parking. We'll leave it there. We'll come back after lunch and we'll go through the rest of the clauses. Any questions before we go? Visitor car parking, well, we did talk about that before, so no is the simple answer. It's just 2 car parks per dwelling, but as I said to you, I strongly advise the apartment building to put at least 2 or 3 for visitor car parking, because it's like a residential building. Of course, people are going to have visitors, and are you going to expect all the visitors to park on the street, and what does that do to the streetscape then, you know, in the surrounding area, especially if there's lots of apartment buildings on one street and everybody's trying to park on the street. It's very limited for the density of the dwelling. Yeah, good question.